everyone, and thank you to the organizers and for this amazing conference. It's really, I have to say, this is really a step forward, I think, for Protolang. So I just really want to say thanks to the organizers and everybody who's put so much effort into this. So my talk is really, it starts with the discussion of how to define proto-language, different ways of defining it, but then I want to go from there to talk about how it might be that we get from proto-language to evolutionary modern language. It seems to me that there are two ways of approaching the definition of proto-language, which of course we have to admit that proto-language is a kind of fictive entity. It's never been observed, and it never will be. But the two approaches to this kind of theoretical notion are, in the first place, structural, in which a proto-language would be a communicative system which is based on words, or their equivalent in other modalities, such as gestures, but with either a complete absence of syntax and morphology, which is the holophrastic hypothesis, that each utterance in the proto-language would be holophrastic, or a radically simplified syntax, such as pivot grammar, which is essentially a way of describing two-word utterances, which was proposed many years ago by Martin Brain in child language development. And in fact, these properties of holophrasis or pivot can be deduced by analogy with child language, and also by analogy with the limitations on the language capacities of enculturated great apes revealed by ape language teaching research. And I'll say a little bit more later about ape language teaching research. And the second way of trying to understand what proto-language might be is essentially semiotic, which is the proposition that languages are symbolic systems, and that in that they differ from signal systems, which are the communication systems of non-linguistic communication in the main. And of course, signal systems are used by humans as well, but they are used by very many other species of animals. And the point there is that proto-languages are symbolic communication systems which are supposed to be, and this is a hypothesis which has been advanced by many people working in archaeology, that are supposed to be co-emergent with other features of hominin symbolic cultures. So the notion is that if we can find symbolism in the material cultural remains of early hominin cultures, then we can infer or deduce the presence of at least some kind of proto-language. Right. So here's a preliminary synthesis of these two different approaches, okay? The synthesis would be proto-language was structurally simple, lacking syntax, perhaps based upon holophrastic expressions, or minimally or maximally it would be based upon some kind of pivot grammar or something which would, perhaps include ordering sequential information, but not recursion. It has been hypothesized by many people to have been preceded by communication using pantomime representations, which is actually the topic of one of the symposia at this conference, which are essentially mimetic signs, and then conventional gestural sign, or it may have been multimodal vocal and gestural and mimetic from the start. But the crucial point is that all of these modalities or uses of modalities are intended to involve symbolic representation not just signaling. So how do we explain this difference between signaling and symbolization? Okay, so here is a simple diagram of communication by signaling. And you can think, if you like, of the famous vervet monkey calls, you know, the calls which, the alarm calls, which distinguish between a snake, a leopard, and an eagle, which was talked about this morning. So what you have in communicative signaling is something like this. You have an environmental cue, perhaps the presence of a predator, which impinges on one organism, which produces a signal which is picked up, again, as was emphasized this morning, usually a broadcast signal rather than a communicatively directed signal, which is picked up by another organism which engages in some action as a response to this, okay? So this is essentially a chain of stimulus-response relationships, and this response will be appropriate to the initial environmental cue, but it does not necessarily involve any kind of shared attention to the original environmental cue, perhaps the predator. Now, this is a very schematic and oversimplified kind of representation of communicative signaling, and I do know that it is more complex than that, but I want to use it in order to draw a conceptual distinction between this and symbolization. Symbolization involves representation of some kind of referential situation, and this diagram is essentially a diagram which is reproduced from the work of the psychologist and linguist Karl Bühler in the 1930s in his masterwork, Theory of Language. I've just changed at least some of the terminology. What we have here is we do have a speaker and a hearer, and the speaker is oriented towards the hearer, and the speaker is producing some kind of symbolic representation which is pointing the listener towards a referential situation which is being shared with the hearer, okay? And so symbolization is the mediation of a kind of joint orientation to a shared referential situation by speaker and hearer, okay? So, and of course, I should say that this is also been referred to in the developmental psychological literature as an instance of what is called triadic communication. And ontogenetically, the emergence of symbolization has a long history in joint attention and joint action. But we don't have time to go into that. So, question. What about evolutionary modern EM languages? When did they emerge? Well, we don't know. But we do have a good idea of what we can call the upper threshold, the time after which it is unlikely that human beings did not have evolutionary modern language. We know that diversification and innovation in material and symbolic cultures first appears in the archaeological record in southern Africa in the Middle Stone Age, developing between 100,000 and 75,000 years ago. And this diversification and innovation is taken by many archaeologists to be the hallmark of behavioral modernity. Behavioral modernity means essentially people who were like us in their symbolic and material capacities, or constructive material capacities. We can also note that continuity in material culture can be observed for at least 40,000 years in indigenous people in South Africa. Okay. What about symbolization? Is it reasonable to think that if that's the kind of upper threshold for language, evolutionary modern language, should we say that symbolization appeared at about the same time? This seems to me to be highly unlikely. Ape language learning studies suggest that the capacity for symbol acquisition and usage is shared by humans and great apes. Just think of the fantastic lecture that we had earlier this afternoon from Professor Matsuzawa, okay? There is no doubt whatsoever that there is a symbolic capacity in great apes. I think there is really no doubt about that, which suggests that this may have been present also in the common ancestor of chimpanzees and hominins about 6 million years ago, okay? So the symbolic capacity is extremely old. However, symbolic practices in extant great apes in the wild are virtually, maybe totally absent, okay? For sure, great apes in the wild communicate. For sure, there is intentionality in the communication. What is not clear is that there is any symbolization. Most of it is imperative, and all of it can be subsumed under the rubric of signaling rather than symbolization. It is not symbolically mediated, okay? Apes have cultures, as we have seen, and they communicate by using vocal and gestural signals, but symbols play virtually no role, perhaps absolutely no role, in either culture or communication in the wild, as opposed to with captive apes. So therefore, we can conclude extant great apes do not have symbolic cultures. So when did hominins become a symbolic species? Well, there is evidence of the engraving by late Homo erectus of quasi-geometric designs on shells from about 500,000 years ago. I'm just going to show you that because I'm short of time. I don't have time to elaborate this. These are geometrically engraved shells about 500,000 years old from a recent paper, well, fairly recent paper, by Jordans et al. Is this symbolization? I don't know, but it is certainly kind of, and it's not necessarily representational, but it is indicative of the externalization of some kind of cognitive process. Here is Neanderthal cave art from Spain about 65,000 years ago. Okay, this does appear to be representational. So, provisional conclusions. Late Homo erectus was a symbol user. Some symbolic communication system or proto-language is likely to have been present in Homo erectus, who were capable of building rafts to navigate between islands and who had mastered the use of fire. So we need now to explain what evolutionary processes governed the elaboration of proto-language into EML, evolutionary modern languages, and when this occurred. Okay, now, most discussions of this transition focus on structural features of proto-language like truncated syntax, holophrasis, and so on. But to me, what is interesting is that the limited combinatorial potential of a proto-language also has semantic consequences in terms of what we can call denotational rigidity and the absence of flexible construal, to use a term introduced by the linguist Ronald Lanaker. What is flexible construal? Flexible construal is the systemic capacity of a language to linguistically represent a referential situation in different ways. These different ways of representing the same situation may be based upon alternations in figure-ground relations or upon alternations in speaker perspective or both. Figure and ground are terms which I assume that you know. It was a terminology first introduced by the Danish psychologist Edgar Rubin. And this is a really simple illustration of figure-ground reversal, okay, or alternation. This referential situation can be represented as either the star, the figure, is above the cross, which is the ground, or the cross, the figure, is below the star, which is the ground, okay? Evolutionary modern languages give us this ability. And now, think of perspectivization. Perspectivization and the flexible construal of kinship relations. We also heard about families in, and the extended family in humans. Now think about this. Things and people have names, but they can be named differently. So, for example, Sally can be the daughter of June and the mother of Donna. Proper names like Sally, June, and Donna are rigid designators. Nouns like daughter are category names, and we can categorize things, events, and relationships in different ways by means of flexible construal. Without flexible construal, a symbolic system would be denotationally rigid. They would be only rigid designators, even if they were category names. This point, by the way, was already made very forcefully by Saussure. Words are not labels for things, okay? Flexible construal enables us to schematically represent referential situations in complex and variable ways. It adds a new level or stage to symbolic representation. So here we have the basic referential triangle, and here we have a kind of addition to it, which is linguistic conceptualization as symbolic construal, in which the linguistic expression schematizes variably and flexibly a referential situation in terms of figure and ground and so on and so forth, against the background of a universe of discourse. At this point, I want to introduce the notion of grounding. Okay, I'm going to propose that linguistic meaning has a dual grounding. It is grounded in the first place in the basically embodied grounding, sensory motor engagements with the physical world, but it is also grounded in our communicative relations with others, discursive grounding, the speaker's situatedness and the speaker's awareness of the situatedness of the addressee in the currently obtaining universe of discourse. This perhaps relates actually to Sverker's point in a very direct kind of way. I'm rushing a little bit, but there we go. So what I want to point out here is that linguistic sense, the notion of sense, which is used by many linguists to talk about lexical meaning, has itself a kind of duality in terms of, on the one hand, denotational meaning, which is related to embodied grounding, and on the other hand, what we can call discursive grounding, which is related to Saussure's notion of semantic value. Okay, I'm just going to take, half a minute. So, this is my proposal for the transition from a proto-language, which is already symbolic, to an evolutionary modern language. Complex kinship systems necessitated alternate construals of individuals. Mythic and collective history narratives involve shifting perspectives and points of view. Autobiographic memory links personal and collective identities, and cognitive symbolic technologies such as numbers, maps, and wayfinders, and perhaps time reckoning systems also involve flexible construals of abstract conceptualizations. Right, I'm finishing there now because I have run out of time, but I want to state explicitly, and this is also an acknowledgement, that the kind of theoretical perspective that I'm trying in a very tightly packaged way to convey today is part of a contribution to Michael Arbib's language-ready brain hypothesis. So I do hypothesize that our anatomically modern ancestors were proto-language users for maybe the first 100,000 years of our species' existence, even though they already possessed language-ready brains. Thank you very much.